Pick up your rifle and get off my range. This isn't a place for tourists. Colonel Richard Donovan's voice cracked across the firing line like a whip, and 40 of America's deadliest men turned to watch him humiliate a quiet woman holding a weathered rifle case. He didn't read her sealed orders. He didn't ask her name. He just pointed at the exit and sneered. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman he'd just mocked in front of Delta operators and Marine recon snipers was the most feared SEAL sniper alive. Before we go further, if stories about respect, courage, and quiet strength move you, take a second to subscribe and follow this one all the way to the end. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from so I can see just how far this story travels tonight. The desert wind came up hot and dry across the training range outside Fort Irwin, and Colonel Richard Donovan stood at the head of the firing line with his hands clasped behind his back like a man who owned the world. He had earned that posture over 40 years. He had bled for it in places the newspapers never named. And on this particular morning, he intended to remind every young shooter in front of him exactly who was in charge. "Gentlemen," he said, letting the word hang in the dry air, "you are the best this country produces. Rangers, Delta, Recon. Some of you have more confirmed kills than most units see in a lifetime. And today you are going to embarrass yourselves, because I designed this course to break you." A few of the men shifted. Nobody spoke. When Colonel Donovan talked, men listened, whether they respected him or feared him, and most of them felt a healthy mixture of both. 2,100 meters, Donovan continued. Beyond that ridgeline, the wind out there does things the manuals don't cover. Your fancy ballistic computers won't save you. Your training might. We'll see who has it and who's been coasting on reputation. It was at that exact moment, as if the desert itself wanted to test the colonel's patience, that a government SUV rolled up the access road and stopped near the edge of the range. The door opened, a woman stepped out. She was perhaps in her early 40s, though the sun and the years had carved something older and steadier into her face. She wore civilian clothes, plain and unremarkable, and she carried a rifle case that had clearly traveled hard miles. She moved without hurry. She didn't scan the range for approval. She simply walked toward the firing line as if she belonged there, and that quiet confidence, more than anything, was what set Donovan's teeth on edge. "Can I help you?" the colonel called out, though his tone made it clear he intended to do the opposite. The woman stopped a respectful distance away. "Senior Chief Sarah Mitchell," she said. Her voice was calm, low, unremarkable. She reached into her jacket and produced a sealed envelope. "I have orders. You'll want to read them before we begin." Donovan looked at the envelope the way a man looks at a fly that has landed on his dinner. "Orders," he repeated. "From who?" "They're sealed for a reason, Colonel." A ripple of something moved through the assembled men. A few of them exchanged glances. Staff Sergeant Ethan Brooks, a young Army sniper standing near the middle of the line, felt the hair on the back of his neck lift, though he couldn't have said why. There was something about the woman, something in the way she stood perfectly still while the wind pulled at everyone else. But Colonel Donovan saw none of that. He saw a civilian. He saw a woman in street clothes carrying a beat-up rifle case, handing him a sealed envelope on his own range in front of his own men and interrupting his own carefully staged lecture. And 40 years of pride rose up in him like floodwater. "Let me tell you how this works, ma'am," he said, stepping toward her, raising his voice so the whole line could hear. "This is a live fire range for special operations personnel. I don't know what contractor sent you, and I don't much care. You don't get to walk onto my range, wave an envelope around, and pretend you have business here." "Colonel, I'm not finished." His face had gone red now. "Every day I get people like you, bureaucrats, consultants, folks who read a book about shooting once and think they understand what these men do. You want to observe. You submit paperwork through channels like everyone else. You do not show up unannounced and interrupt my training." Sarah Mitchell said nothing. She simply held the envelope out a moment longer, and when it became clear he would not take it, she lowered her hand and slipped it back into her jacket. "Understood," she said. That single word, calm and unbothered, seemed to enrage him further. He had expected an argument. He had expected her to bluster, to invoke some name, to demand he read the orders. Instead, she had simply accepted his refusal, and somehow that made him look smaller, and he knew it, and it made him angrier still. "Pick up your rifle and get off my range," he snapped. "This isn't a place for tourists." For a long moment, the woman looked at him. Not with anger, not with wounded pride. She looked at him the way a doctor looks at a patient who has just refused sound advice, with a kind of patient, distant regret. Then she nodded once, turned, and walked back toward the SUV. She set her rifle case gently on the hood, leaned against the vehicle, folded her arms, and began quietly to watch. "All right," Donovan barked, spinning back to his men. "Show's over. Let's find out who among you can actually shoot." First relay on the line. And so the day began. Staff Sergeant Ethan Brooks was in the second relay, which meant he had time to watch the men ahead of him, and what he watched troubled him deeply. The first shooter was a ranger named Coleman, a big, quiet man with 2 combat deployments and a reputation for ice-cold nerves. Coleman settled behind his rifle, worked his ballistic solution, made his adjustments, and fired. The spotter, watching through a powerful scope, waited a long beat, then said flatly, "Miss, low and left, way off." Coleman frowned. He adjusted. He fired again. "Miss," the spotter said. "Different this time, high and right." That got everyone's attention. A miss was one thing, but a miss low left followed by a miss high right with the same hold on a windless-looking morning made no sense at all. Coleman fired 8 rounds. He hit twice. When he rolled off the line, his jaw was tight and his eyes were confused, and he was one of the best shooters in the entire United States Army. The next man did no better, nor the man after him. One by one, the finest long-range shooters in the country laid down behind their rifles, applied everything they knew, and watched their bullets sail off into the desert as if some invisible hand were slapping them out of the air. Colonel Donovan watched with grim satisfaction that slowly curdled into anger. "Pathetic," he said loud enough to carry. 2 hits out of 8, 3 out of 10. This is what we're sending downrange. Now, this is the elite." He shook his head in disgust. "You know what the problem is? Technology. You boys have been raised on ballistic apps and rangefinders and computer solutions until you can't read a wind flag to save your lives. In my day, we did this with a mild-dot reticle and a brain. Now look at you." Nobody answered him. What was there to say? They were failing and they didn't understand why, and a man who doesn't understand why he's failing has nothing to defend himself with. Ethan Brooks, waiting his turn, kept stealing glances at the woman by the SUV. Sarah Mitchell hadn't moved. She wasn't watching the shooters. She wasn't watching the targets. She was watching the ground and the air and the light. Every so often, her head would tilt slightly, tracking something invisible. Once Ethan saw her pick up a pinch of dust and let it fall, then watched the way it drifted before it hit the sand. Twice he saw her look up at a hawk riding a thermal high above the ridgeline and follow its path with narrowed eyes. She wasn't idle. She was reading something. And Ethan Brooks, who had spent his whole young career trying to understand wind, suddenly felt like a child watching a master work a language he had only ever stumbled through. Then it was his turn. Ethan settled behind his rifle. He built his solution the way he'd been trained. He accounted for the range, the temperature, the humidity, the one wind flag he could see limp near the target berm. He steadied his breathing. He pressed the trigger. "Miss," his spotter said. "Right, 2 feet, maybe more." Ethan blinked. 2 feet of right drift with a flag showing almost nothing. He held left hard and fired again. "Miss, now you're 2 feet left." That was impossible. That was flatly physically impossible. He had corrected in the direction of his miss, and the bullet had gone the opposite way. He lay there behind his rifle with his heart pounding and a cold, sick feeling spreading through his chest, because a sniper who cannot trust the relationship between his correction and his impact is a sniper who has lost the ground beneath his feet. He fired his remaining rounds. He hit 3 of 10. When he rolled off the line, Colonel Donovan was standing over him. "Brooks," the colonel said, "you had the highest marksmanship scores in your class." "What was that?" "I don't know, sir," Ethan admitted, and hated the words even as he said them. "The wind's doing something I can't read. My corrections are making it worse." "Your corrections are making it worse," Donovan repeated mockingly. "Or maybe, Sergeant, you just aren't as good as your paperwork says you are." Ethan said nothing, but something hardened in him, and it wasn't defiance toward the colonel. It was a need to understand. He had spent his life chasing the wind, and today the wind had made a fool of him, and he could not walk off this range without knowing why. So while the third relay moved onto the line, Ethan Brooks did something no one else had thought to do. He walked across the range toward the woman leaning against the government SUV. She watched him come without surprise, as if she'd been expecting him. "Ma'am," Ethan said, stopping a few feet away, "I know I'm probably out of line, And I know the colonel wants you gone, but I have to ask you something because you've been standing here for 2 hours reading something the rest of us can't see." A small smile touched the corner of Sarah Mitchell's mouth. "Ask your questions, Sergeant." "The wind." Ethan gestured helplessly toward the range. "None of us can figure it out. Our corrections don't hold. We push right, we miss left. We push left, we miss right. It's like the bullet forgets what we told it." "What are we missing?" For a moment, she just looked at him, measuring him, and Ethan had the strange sensation of being weighed on a scale he couldn't see. Then she pushed off the SUV and came to stand beside him, facing the range. "How many winds do you think are out there?" she asked. Ethan frowned. "One, there's one wind. It's just gusty." "That's what everyone thinks." She lifted her chin toward the distant ridge. "Watch the flag near the firing line." Ethan looked. The near flag hung mostly limp, twitching gently from left to right. "Now watch the dust in that low draw about halfway out, right there where the ground dips." Ethan squinted. Far downrange in a shallow depression in the desert floor, a thin ribbon of dust was blowing the opposite direction, right to left. His mouth went dry. "And now," Sarah said quietly, "watch that hawk over the target berm. Watch which way he has to crab to hold his position." Ethan found the hawk. The bird hung nearly motionless in the sky above the far targets, but it was angled hard, fighting a wind that was pushing it in a third direction, entirely quartering across the valley from the high ground. "There aren't one," Sarah Mitchell said. "There are three. Three completely separate wind layers at three different distances, moving three different directions. The one you feel at the firing line has almost nothing to do with what your bullet flies through at 1,100 meters, and even less to do with what hits it at 2,000. When you correct for the wind on your cheek, you're correcting for a wind your bullet barely touches. That's why your holds do the opposite of what you expect. You're solving the wrong problem." Ethan stood there in the beating sun, and he felt the world tilt very slightly on its axis. It was, he would say later, like watching someone unlock a door he'd been throwing his shoulder against for years. "How," he breathed, "how do you even read that? How do you weigh three winds against each other and know how much each one matters?" "That," Sarah said, and there was something almost gentle in her voice now, "takes a long time to learn. And most people never learn it because most people are too busy blaming their rifle or their scope or the man next to them to stand still and actually look. You walked over here and asked. That already puts you ahead of every man on that line." Ethan opened his mouth to ask more, but he never got the chance. Because that was the moment the sound reached them, a low, rhythmic thumping that grew from the horizon like an approaching heartbeat, and every head on the range turned toward the sky. A Black Hawk helicopter was coming in fast and low over the ridgeline. Colonel Donovan turned from the firing line with a scowl shading his eyes against the sun. He wasn't expecting anyone. There was no scheduled flight, no visitor on his calendar, no reason for a Black Hawk to be dropping onto his range in the middle of a training evolution. The helicopter flared and settled onto an open patch of hardpack 100 yards off, kicking up a storm of dust and grit, and the whole range squinted and turned their faces from the rotor wash. When the dust settled, a man stepped down from the aircraft. He was tall and lean, with iron gray hair cut close and the unmistakable bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime being obeyed. 3 silver stars glinted on his collar. Behind him came 2 aides in a security detail, but no one was looking at them. Every eye on that range was locked on the general. Colonel Donovan snapped to attention so fast he nearly hurt himself. He arranged his features into the practiced welcome of a career officer, greeting a superior, and he began striding forward to meet the general, already composing the words in his head. "Sir, welcome to my range. We're conducting a rather illuminating evaluation of long-range marksmanship, and I'm afraid the results are exposing some troubling deficiencies in..." But Lieutenant General Michael Anderson did not stop to greet Colonel Donovan. He didn't slow down. He didn't return the colonel's salute. He looked right past him, as if the man weren't there at all, and Donovan found himself standing at rigid attention with his hand frozen at his brow, watching the 3-star general walk directly past him toward the government SUV at the edge of the range, toward Sarah Mitchell. A cold, creeping confusion began to spread through Colonel Donovan's chest. General Anderson crossed the entire range, past 40 of the country's finest operators, past the colonel who commanded them, and stopped in front of the quiet woman in civilian clothes, whom Donovan had thrown off his line 2 hours before. And then Lieutenant General Michael Anderson, commander of a classified Joint Special Operations Task Force, a man with 3 stars and 35 years of war behind him, came to attention and he saluted her. The entire firing line went absolutely still. Ethan Brooks, standing just a few feet away, felt his breath stop in his throat. A 3-star general did not salute a senior chief. A 3-star general did not salute anyone. Rank flowed downhill. The whole architecture of the military rested on that simple truth, and Ethan had just watched it invert before his eyes. Sarah Mitchell straightened and returned the salute with quiet precision. "Sir," she said. "Senior Chief," General Anderson replied, and his voice carried across the silent range. "My apologies for the entrance. Timeline moved up. We need to talk." Then he glanced past her at the frozen ranks of operators, at the stunned instructors, and finally slowly at Colonel Richard Donovan, who was still standing at attention with his hand halfway to his brow and an expression of dawning horror on his face. "Colonel Donovan," the general said. "Sir." Donovan's voice came out thinner than he intended. Anderson studied him for a long, cold moment. "I sent this woman to your range with sealed orders. Did you read them, Mom?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing on that range. "Sir, Donovan swallowed. "There was a woman in civilian clothes. She presented an envelope, but I had no way of verifying. Did you read the orders, Colonel, yes or no?" Donovan's jaw worked. 40 years of pride were dying in his chest second by second in front of everyone he commanded. "No, sir," he said finally. "I did not." General Anderson exhaled slowly through his nose. "No," he repeated. "You didn't. You threw her off your range instead." He turned to Sarah. "Senior Chief, is that accurate?" Sarah Mitchell looked at the colonel. She had every right in that moment to bury him. A single honest sentence would have ended his career on the spot, and everyone knew it, and everyone waited for it. "The colonel was protecting his range from an unverified civilian, sir," she said evenly. "I didn't press the matter." It was Ethan realized a kindness. She was giving the man an inch of dignity he had done absolutely nothing to earn. And somehow that mercy landed harder than any accusation could have. Colonel Donovan's face crumpled with a shame so complete that Ethan almost had to look away. "Generous of you," Anderson said quietly. Then he raised his voice so the whole range could hear him, because what came next was something these men needed to understand. "Gentlemen," the general said, "I want you to meet the woman your colonel called a tourist." He let that sit for a moment. "Senior Chief Sarah Mitchell, DevGru. Some of you know the call sign even if you've never known the name behind it. Ghost Echo." A visible shockwave rolled through the ranks. Ethan heard someone behind him whisper the call sign like a curse or a prayer. Ghost Echo. Every long-range shooter in the special operations community had heard the stories. The impossible extraction in the mountains where a single shooter had held off an entire assault force to cover a bleeding team's retreat. The hostage rescue, where 3 targets had dropped in 3 seconds at a distance the after-action report had classified because no one at headquarters believed it. The rooftop overwatch that had kept a pin squad alive through an entire night. They were legends, the kind of stories that got told around fires, and half believed the kind of stories everyone assumed had been exaggerated in the retelling. And the shooter at the center of all of them had been standing by an SUV all morning, watching the wind while Colonel Donovan called her a tourist. The most successful active sniper in naval special warfare. Anderson continued, his eyes sweeping the ranks. More classified rescue operations than I'm cleared to describe to this audience. The woman whose shots your instructors teach as case studies without knowing whose shots they are. He paused. That is who your colonel ordered off this range. Colonel Donovan looked like a man who had swallowed something that was slowly killing him. He had spent the entire day insulting the best shooter in the country. He had lectured a legend about weakness and technology. He had thrown Ghost Echo off his firing line and told her to stop pretending she belonged, while she stood there and quietly read 3 wins that not one of his elite operators could see. Ethan Brooks looked at Sarah Mitchell with entirely new eyes, and then remembering the last few minutes with a strange dawning wonder. She had come over to answer his question. She had stood beside a nobody staff sergeant and patiently explained the 3 wins when she could have simply waited for the general to arrive and let the whole range grovel. She hadn't needed to teach him anything. She had done it anyway. "Now," General Anderson said, and the mockery was gone from his voice, replaced by something graver. The senior chief tells me your shooters have been failing this course all morning. 2 hits out of 8, 3 out of 10. He looked around at the men and his expression softened just slightly. I want you to hear something, and I want you to hear it clearly. The problem is not the shooters. Colonel Donovan flinched. The problem, the general went on, is that this course was built by men who believed there is one wind on this range. There are 3, and unless you know how to read all 3 and weigh them against each other in real time, no amount of skill or training or courage is going to put your rounds on target at 2,000 meters. Your men aren't weak. They've been set an impossible problem and told they were failures for not solving it. That ends now. He turned to Sarah. Senior Chief, would you show them? Sarah Mitchell looked out over the range at the distant targets, shimmering in the heat beyond 2,000 meters, at the 3 invisible rivers of moving air she alone could see. Then she looked at Colonel Donovan. Colonel, she said, and her voice was neither cruel nor kind. It was simply level. You told me to pick up my rifle. May I? Donovan's throat bobbed. Senior Chief, he managed, please. She walked to the SUV and lifted the weathered case off the hood. She carried it to the firing line and the operators parted for her without a word, and there was a reverence in the way they made room that no one had shown Colonel Donovan all morning. She knelt and opened the case, and inside, cradled in foam, lay a rifle that had clearly been to the far corners of the earth and back. She lifted it out with the unhurried care of someone handling an old friend. Ethan Brooks moved closer, drawn like everyone else. He couldn't have stayed away if he tried. Sarah settled into position behind the rifle. She did not pull out a ballistic computer. She did not consult a data book. She did not ask the range for the distance or the temperature or the humidity or a single scrap of the information every other shooter had leaned on all morning. She simply lay there for a long moment, breathing slow, and read the air. The whole range held its breath with her. 3 targets, General Anderson said quietly. Left, center, right, beyond 2100, on your time, Senior Chief. Ethan watched her eyes. They moved once, tracking something invisible from the near flag, out across the low draw to the distant berm, weighing the 3 winds the way she'd described, holding the whole moving equation of the air in her mind. Her breathing slowed further. The range went so silent that Ethan could hear his own heartbeat. She fired. The rifle bucked. A heartbeat and a half later, far downrange, the left target rang with a hit so clean the spotter didn't even need to call it. Before the echo faded, she shifted, breathed, and fired again. Center target, hit, and then smooth and unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world, she fired a 3rd time. Right target, hit. 3 rounds, 3 impacts, beyond 2,100 meters, across 3 shifting winds. No practice shot, no range data, no ballistic software, no corrections, no second guessing. She had simply read the invisible, trusted what she read, and put 3 bullets exactly where she wanted them, while 40 of the best shooters in America watched and could not believe their eyes. The range stayed silent for a long, long moment. Then someone, one of the Delta operators near the back, breathed a single soft word. My God. Ethan Brooks felt something break open in his chest. He had spent his whole career believing that shots like that belonged to legend, to exaggeration, to campfire stories that grew in the telling. He had just watched one happen 10 feet away, and the shooter was already rolling off the line, already setting the rifle down, with the same quiet care she'd taken lifting it, as if she'd done nothing more remarkable than sign her name. Colonel Donovan stared at the 3 distant targets and then at the woman he'd thrown off his range, and the color drained slowly from his face as the full weight of the day settled onto him. He had lectured a legend. He had mocked greatness to its face. He had stood in the presence of the finest shooter alive and called her a tourist because she was quiet, because she was patient, because she carried herself without the swagger he'd spent 40 years mistaking for competence. Sarah Mitchell stood dusted off her knees and looked at him, and there was no triumph in her face. That was the thing Ethan would remember longest. She had every reason to gloat, and there was nothing in her expression but a kind of tired, honest steadiness. You want to know why your men are failing, Colonel, she said. It isn't weakness. It isn't technology. It's that somebody told them there was one wind, and they believed it because the person who told them outranked them. Rank made them stop looking. She held his gaze. Rank does that. It's the most dangerous thing about it. Donovan had no answer. There was none to give. General Anderson stepped forward again, and now his voice dropped, and the whole range leaned in, because they could all feel that something larger was arriving. "Gentlemen," he said, "I'm going to level with you because you've earned it and because we're out of time for anything else." He looked around the ranks. This was never a marksmanship qualification. A murmur moved through the men. "You were told you were being evaluated on skill," Anderson said. "You weren't, not really. This range, these impossible targets, these 3 wins, nobody could read. All of it was a selection. And the senior chief wasn't sent here to teach you how to shoot." He turned towards Sarah. "She was sent here to choose." Ethan felt his pulse jump. "Choose for what, sir?" one of the operators asked, and even a hardened Delta man's voice had an edge of tension in it now. General Anderson was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, the words fell heavy on the desert air. 6 days ago, an American intelligence officer went dark deep inside hostile mountain territory, he said. "One of ours, working alone far past the edge of anywhere we can reach easily. We know he's alive. We know roughly where he is. And we know there's exactly one route out of those mountains that a team could use to pull him." He paused. "Satellite imagery shows that route is overwatched by multiple enemy sniper positions sitting on high ground, covering the only corridor he can escape through. Any team that goes in to get him has to first take those positions out, or the corridor stays closed and the man dies waiting for a country he's starting to think has forgotten him." The range was utterly silent now. "To open that corridor," Anderson continued, "we need shooters who can make impossible shots, long range, shifting winds, high ground, the kind of shots most men will tell you can't be made." He looked around at them and his gaze was heavy. "The kind of shots you just watched the senior chief make 3 times without breaking a sweat. We need a small team of people who can do what she does or as close to it as human beings get. And we need them tonight." Ethan Brooks understood suddenly and completely what he had been part of all day. The impossible course. The failures that weren't failures. The quiet woman watching the wind instead of the shooters. She hadn't been ignoring them, she'd been studying them. Watching who broke and who bore down. Watching who blamed the range and who kept trying to solve the problem. Watching who threw up their hands and who walked across a firing line in the beating sun to ask a stranger a humble question. He looked at Sarah Mitchell, and to his shock, she was already looking back at him. "Sir," Sarah said to the general, though her eyes stayed on Ethan, "I've made my assessment." "Already," Anderson raised an eyebrow. "I made most of it hours ago." Now she looked away from Ethan and swept her gaze across the whole range, across the elite operators who had failed the course, across the men with more combat experience than most units see in a career. "You want to know what I was looking for out here today? It wasn't the highest score. Every one of these men can shoot. That was never in question." She paused. "I was watching what they did after they missed." The men shifted. Nobody spoke. "Because in those mountains," Sarah said, "everyone misses. The wind will lie to you. The range will lie to you. The first shot will be wrong more often than it's right. And the enemy will be shooting back, and men you know will be bleeding, and the mission will hang on what you do in the 10 seconds after everything goes wrong." Her voice hardened. "I don't need a perfect shooter. Perfect shooters fall apart the first time the world doesn't cooperate. I need someone who stays calm after failure. Someone who keeps solving the problem instead of blaming the rifle or the wind or the man next to them. Someone who stays curious when everyone else has given up and started making excuses." She turned deliberately and pointed at Staff Sergeant Ethan Brooks. "That man hit 3 out of 10 this morning," she said. "Same as half the line. His score doesn't matter to me at all." She let her hand fall. "But when he failed, he didn't blame his rifle. He didn't blame his scope. He didn't sulk, and he didn't make excuses. He walked across an entire firing range in front of a colonel who wanted me gone. And he asked a stranger the one question that everyone else was too proud to ask. What am I missing?" Her gaze held Ethan's, and there was something in it that felt to him like the first real recognition he'd ever received in his life. "That's the man I want in the mountains behind me. Not because he's the best shot on this range, because he's the only one who kept looking for the truth after the truth had humiliated him." Ethan Brooks stood in the beating desert sun and could not speak. Colonel Donovan watched all of it with the hollow expression of a man realizing far too late exactly what he had spent his day doing. He had lectured about weakness in front of the strongest person he'd ever meet. He had mocked technology dependence in front of a shooter who used no technology at all. He had thrown greatness off his range and called it a tourist. And the young sergeant he'd sneered at for admitting he couldn't read the wind, the one he'd told probably wasn't as good as his paperwork, had just been chosen by a living legend for the most important mission of his life, precisely because he'd been humble enough to ask. General Anderson looked at the colonel one last time. "We'll talk later, Donovan," he said, and there was no warmth in it at all. "About orders, about what happens when a man lets his pride override his judgment on an active operation. For now, stand down. This range belongs to the senior chief." And Colonel Richard Donovan, 40 years a soldier, stepped back from his own firing line and said nothing because there was nothing left in him to say. Sarah Mitchell walked over to Ethan Brooks. Up close, he could see the fine lines around her eyes, the deep steadiness that came from having been to the worst places in the world and come back. She looked at him for a moment, taking his measure one final time. "You still want to know how to read 3 winds, Sergeant?" she asked quietly. Ethan's throat was tight. "Yes, ma'am, more than anything." The faintest smile touched the corner of her mouth. "Good," she said, "because you're going to have to learn fast." She glanced up at the ridgeline, at the sun already sliding toward the western mountains, and her expression turned grave. "There's a man in those mountains counting on it, and we don't have much time." She turned to look at the small group of operators. The general was already pulling aside the ones who, like Ethan, had failed the course with grace instead of excuses. And as the shadows began to lengthen across the desert floor, Ethan Brooks understood that his life had changed completely in the span of a single morning, and that the quiet woman a colonel had tried to throw away was about to lead him somewhere very few men ever came back from. The general didn't waste another minute on Colonel Donovan. He turned his back on the man completely and walked toward a hardened operations tent that his security detail had already begun setting up at the far edge of the range, and he beckoned once over his shoulder. "Senior Chief, the ones you've picked, with me. Everyone else stand by." Sarah Mitchell touched Ethan's shoulder. "Come on, Sergeant. School's about to start, and you've got a lot to learn in very little time." Ethan followed her, and as he walked, he felt the eyes of 40 men on his back. Some of those looks were confusion. Some were resentment. He'd hit 3 out of 10 this morning, same as men who'd done 4 combat tours, and he was the one walking into the general's tent. He understood it. He didn't blame them. But he also knew with a certainty that surprised him that he wasn't going to waste this. Inside the tent, the temperature dropped and the light went dim and cool. A folding table had been set up in the center, and on it lay a laptop, a stack of folders stamped with markings Ethan wasn't cleared to read a week ago, and a set of satellite photographs that made his stomach tighten just looking at them. General Anderson stood at the head of the table. Beside him was a woman in a rumpled analyst's jacket with tired eyes and a coffee cup she gripped like a life raft. 6 operators filed in behind Sarah and Ethan. Ethan recognized a few of them. The big Ranger Coleman who'd shot first that morning and missed. A lean Delta operator named Reyes with a scar through one eyebrow. A quiet Marine recon sniper named Tran, who hadn't said 10 words all day. 2 others Ethan didn't know by name. And himself. 7 counting Sarah. "Everybody in this tent," Anderson said, "failed the course today." Nobody moved. "I want that understood before we go one step further. Every single person the senior chief selected missed more targets than they hit this morning. If I'd run this the way your colonel wanted to run it on score alone, I'd have picked 7 different people, and every one of them would have gotten this operative killed." He let that land. "The senior chief picked you because of what you did with your failure. Remember that when the shooting starts and you miss, because you will miss." Sarah stepped up beside the table. "Sir, before you brief them, I need 90 minutes with them on the line. They need to understand the 3 wins, or the rest of this doesn't matter." "You've got 60, Anderson said. "The bird that takes us to staging leaves at 1900. It's already past 1400. Do the math." Ethan did the math. 5 hours until they flew toward the worst night of their lives. He felt his heart begin to pound, and then he made himself breathe slow the way he'd watched Sarah breathe behind the rifle, and the pounding eased. Sarah noticed. She always noticed. "Good," she said quietly just to him. "You're already learning the most important part, and it's got nothing to do with wind. It's got to do with your own heartbeat. Hold on to that." She turned to the group. "All right, on the line. Rifles now." The next hour was the fastest and hardest lesson of Ethan Brooks's life. Sarah laid them down behind their rifles in a row, and she did not let them shoot. Not at first. She made them watch. She made them find the near flag, then the ribbon of dust in the low draw, then the hawk over the target berm, and she made each of them describe out loud what all three were doing. Coleman, she said, near flag. Left to right, sir, ma'am, light, or maybe 4 miles an hour. Draw. The big ranger squinted. It took him almost a minute. Right to left, he said finally, and Ethan could hear the disbelief in his own voice echoing in Coleman's. That's backward from the near flag. That's the opposite direction. That's the second wind, Sarah said. It lives in the low ground, and it runs the other way, and it's the one that ate half your shots this morning. Now the ridge, the hawk. Which way is he fighting? Coleman found the hawk. He watched it a long time. Quartering, he said, from the high left. That's a third one. That's a third wind, ma'am, and it's stronger than either of the other two. Now you're seeing, Sarah said, that's the wind that lives up high, where your bullet spends the last third of its flight, and it hits hardest, and it's the one nobody teaches you to look for because you can't feel it on your face, and the flags on the ground don't show it. You have to read it off the birds, the dust, the shimmer, the way the grass moves on the far slopes. You have to read the air you can't feel. She looked down the line at all of them. Every one of you spent this morning correcting for the wind on your cheek. And the wind on your cheek is the least important wind on this range. Forget your cheek. Read the whole valley. Ethan felt something reorganizing itself in his mind, some fundamental furniture being moved into its proper place after years of being wrong. He'd been taught wind as a single number. She was teaching it as a living thing, layered and contradictory, a conversation between three separate rivers of air, and once he saw it that way, he couldn't unsee it. Reyes, Sarah said, first shot, left target. Tell me your hold before you fire and tell me which wind you're weighing heaviest. The Delta operator lay behind his rifle and worked it out loud, haltingly, weighing the high quartering wind against the reverse draw wind, and Sarah corrected him twice, sharp and fast, and then said, send it. Reyes fired. A pause. The spotter, one of Anderson's men, called it. Hit. Low edge, but a hit. A ragged breath went through the 7 of them. It was the first clean hit any of them had made all day, past 2,000 meters, and they'd made it because a woman had spent 1 hour teaching them to see what a whole morning of failure hadn't. Again, Sarah said, everybody, and this time I want you calling all 3 winds out loud before every shot until it's automatic, because in those mountains, you won't have time to think about it. It has to live in your bones. They shot, and missed, and hit, and missed, and hit, and slowly the hits began to outnumber the misses. Coleman rang the center target and let out a low whoop before he caught himself. Tran, the silent Marine, put 3 in a row into the right target and said nothing at all. But Ethan saw the corner of his mouth twitch. And Ethan himself, when his turn came, lay behind his rifle, found the 3 winds, the way she'd taught him, weighed them, felt the whole valley in his mind, and squeezed. Hit, the spotter called. Center, dead center. Ethan lay there for a second with his heart hammering, and he felt Sarah's hand come down on his shoulder. That's the shot you couldn't make 4 hours ago, she said quietly. Nothing changed but what you're willing to see. Remember that too. At 1500 hours, Anderson stuck his head out of the tent. Senior Chief, time. Bring them in. They need the brief, and they needed it an hour ago. Sarah stood them up off the line. As they walked back toward the tent, Ethan fell in beside her. Ma'am, he said low, can I ask you something? You've earned the right to ask me anything, Sergeant. That's rather the whole point of why you're here. How many times have you done this, a rescue like the one he's about to describe? She was quiet for a few steps. Enough to know that the number doesn't help you, she said finally. Everyone is different. Everyone takes something out of you that you don't get back. And every single time there's a moment where the smart thing, the sane thing is to turn around and go home, and the man you came for is counting on you not being smart or sane. She glanced at him. You still want to be here? Yes, ma'am. Then don't ask me how many. Ask me how we were going to keep this one alive. That's the only number that matters now. They ducked back into the tent. General Anderson had the satellite photos spread across the table, and the tired analyst was standing over them with a laser pointer that trembled slightly in her hand. Anderson gestured the 7 of them close. This is Dr. Halverson, he said, nodding at the analyst. She's been running the intelligence picture on this operative since he went dark 6 days ago. She hasn't slept in about 3 of those. Listen to her like your lives depend on it, because they do. Halverson cleared her throat. Her voice was steady, even if her hands weren't. The man we're going in for is a case officer. I'm not going to give you his real name. His work name is Cardinal. 6 days ago, he was running a source meeting in a village at the base of these mountains when the meeting went wrong. We still don't know if he was sold out or just unlucky. Either way, he ran. He ran up into the high country, which is exactly what his training told him to do, and exactly what saved his life, because the low ground filled up with people hunting him within the hour. She moved the laser to a jagged line of ridges. He's been moving at night and hiding by day for 6 days. He's made contact with us twice, both times for less than 30 seconds, using an emergency beacon that we told him to use exactly twice and no more, because every time he keys it, he risks giving away his position. The last transmission was 11 hours ago. It gave us this. She tapped a point high on the ridgeline. A cave system, small. He's holed up there. He's hurt. He didn't say how bad, but he said, and I'm quoting the transmission exactly because the wording matters. He said, legs bad, can't run anymore. This is where I make my stand. Her voice caught just slightly. That's a man who's decided he's going to die up there. And he might be right unless we do something about it in the next 36 hours, because he also told us the last thing we know, which is that he's almost out of water. The tent was silent. Ethan stared at the satellite image of the cave, at that tiny dark smudge high on a hostile mountain. And he thought about a man he'd never met lying in the dark with a ruined leg and an empty canteen, telling his own country over a 30-second window that this was where he'd make his stand. Something cold and hard formed in his chest, and it wasn't fear, it was resolve. Show them the problem, Anderson said quietly. Halverson moved the laser down from the cave, tracing a thin serpentine line that wound down the mountain. This is the only route a team can use to reach him and get him out. Everything else is either sheer rock or so exposed you'd be dead before you climbed 50 feet. This corridor is the whole game. It's the only door in and the only door out. She paused. And they know it too. The laser jumped to 4 points overlooking the corridor, positioned along the high ground like teeth around a throat. We've confirmed 4 enemy overwatch positions, she said. Sniper teams, good ones. Not farmers with rifles. These are trained shooters positioned deliberately with interlocking fields of fire covering the entire extraction corridor. Anyone who moves up that route in daylight dies. Anyone who moves up it at night without dealing with these positions first dies almost as fast, because at least 2 of these teams have thermal optics. She set the laser down. That's the problem. 4 dug-in enemy sniper teams on high ground and 1 corridor that a rescue team has to move through to reach a wounded man who's out of water. Any team that goes in has to eliminate those 4 positions in the dark at long range across terrain that does to wind exactly what this range does before they can open the door. Sarah Mitchell stepped up to the table and looked at the photographs for a long moment. She didn't say anything at first. She just studied the 4 enemy positions the way she'd studied the wind all morning, with a patience that made the operators around her go still. Ranges, she said finally. Halverson pulled up a data sheet. From the nearest feasible shooting positions we've identified for your team, the enemy overwatch runs between 1,900 and 2,400 meters. Position 4, the farthest is the worst. 2,400 meters, and it sits highest, which means it sees the most of the corridor. And it dies last because to get an angle on it, you have to expose yourself to the other 3 first. And the wind's up there, Sarah said. Worse than this range, Halverson admitted. Mountain terrain. Valleys funnel the wind ridges, split it. Thermals rise off the rock as it heats and sinks as it cools. Your window is a few hours before dawn, when the air is most stable, but even then our meteorology people are telling us to expect at least 3 distinct wind layers through the corridor at any given time. Sarah looked up, and for the first time all day, Ethan saw something like a grim smile touch her mouth. 3 winds, she said. Well, now you know why I ran the course the way I did. She looked around at the 7 of them. This wasn't a coincidence. This range was built to be a scale model of that mountain. 3 winds here, 3 winds there, long range here, longer range there. I needed to see who could learn to read 3 winds under pressure, because that is the exact skill that opens that corridor, and there is no time to teach it from scratch once we're in country. She tapped the photograph. So, this morning was the test. You passed. Now here's what we're actually going to do. She laid it out fast and clean. 7 shooters in 3 teams plus herself. Insert by helicopter after dark, 10 kilometers out far enough that the enemy wouldn't hear the rotors. Move on foot through the night to a set of firing positions she pointed out on the map, high spots on the ridge opposite the enemy overwatch, each with a clean line to 1 or 2 of the enemy teams. The catch, and she said it plainly, was that all 4 enemy positions had to die within a few seconds of each other. The moment the first enemy sniper dropped, the others would go to ground, and if even one of them lived and got behind cover with a thermal scope, the corridor stayed closed and the whole team was pinned in the open. 4 positions, Rhea said slowly. Simultaneous, at 2,000 meters plus, in mountain wind, in the dark. That's the shot, Sarah said. That's why you're here. That's why score didn't matter to me, and character did, because we are going to lie on that ridge in the cold, and we are going to have exactly 1 chance to make 4 impossible shots at the same time. And if any one of us panics or blames the wind or freezes after a miss, a man dies in a cave, and so probably do the rest of us. She looked at each of them in turn. Coleman, you and Tran take positions 1 and 2, the near pair, 19 and 2100. Reyes, you and Vasquez take position 3, the 2200. Brooks, she stopped on Ethan. You're with me, position 4, the far one. 2400 meters highest ground, hardest wind dies last and hardest. You and me, Sergeant. Ethan's mouth went dry. The hardest shot on the mountain, and she wanted him beside her for it 4 hours after he'd hit 3 out of 10. Ma'am, he said, and his voice came out steadier than he felt. Why me for the hard one? Coleman's got twice my experience. Reyes has been doing this a decade. Sarah held his gaze. Because when Coleman misses, he gets angry, she said. When Reyes misses, he gets fast tries to rush the follow-up. Good men, both of them, but that's what pressure does to them. I watched it all morning. When you miss, Sergeant, you get curious. You slow down and you look for the thing you didn't see. And on that far position at 2,400 meters in the dark, the first shot is probably going to miss no matter who takes it. I don't need the man who shoots best. I need the man who thinks best after he shoots worst. That's you. It's been you since about 10 o'clock this morning. Ethan Brooks didn't know what to say to that, so he said the only thing there was to say. Yes, ma'am. Anderson checked his watch. 1600. Kit up. Rehearsal on the sand table at 17. Wheels up at 19. Any questions that aren't going to get answered by doing the job, ask them now, because after this tent, we're operational and we're quiet. There was one question. It came from the back from Vasquez, the shooter. Ethan didn't know, a wiry man with a flat, calm voice. General, straight answer. What are the odds we all come home from this? Anderson didn't insult him with false comfort. He looked at Vasquez for a long moment. Not good, he said. 4 enemy sniper teams deep in hostile territory, wounded man to carry out corridor that closes the instant anything goes wrong. If I told you this was low risk, you'd know I was lying, and you'd trust nothing else I said tonight. So I won't. It's bad. The honest number is that some of the people in this tent may not come back. He paused. Every one of you volunteered when you walked through that flap and stayed. The door's right there. Nobody in this tent will think less of any man who uses it. Not me, not the senior chief. This is not a mission anyone gets ordered into. Nobody moved toward the door. Ethan looked around at the 6 others, at the big ranger and the scarred Delta man and the silent Marine and the 2 he barely knew, and at Sarah Mitchell standing calm at the head of the table, and he understood that he was in a room full of people who had just been told they might die and had all silently decided to go anyway. He'd read about moments like this his whole life. He'd never been inside one. It felt nothing like the books. It was quieter and heavier and more real. All right, Anderson said softly. Then God help you and let's get to work. The next 3 hours moved like water going over a falls. They kitted up. They rehearsed on a sand table Halverson's people built out of the satellite imagery, walking the road a dozen times until every man could find his firing position blind. Sarah drilled them on the winds again and again, making them recite the 3-layer read until it was reflex. She paired Ethan off to the side and worked him harder than the rest, running him through the far position's specific geometry over and over, the 2,400-meter hold, the way the high quartering wind would fight him, the exact sequence of what to do when the first shot missed. When you miss, she said for what felt like the 100th time, you do not chase it. You do not panic, correct. You read what the trace told you, you make one deliberate adjustment, and you send the second round before the enemy has finished reacting to the first. The whole thing lives or dies in about 4 seconds. First shot to confirmed kill, 4 seconds. We are going to make that 4 seconds so automatic you could do it in your sleep, because you're going to have to do it while your hands are shaking and a man is dying 2 kilometers away. Yes, ma'am. Say the sequence. Read send watch the trace 1 correction send again, 4 seconds. Again. Read send watch the trace 1 correction send again. Again. She made him say it until it stopped being words and became something lower than words, something in the body. And somewhere in the middle of the 100th repetition, Ethan realized his hands had stopped shaking and that this too was something she'd done on purpose. At 1800 hours, as the light began to go long and golden across the range, Sarah pulled Ethan aside one last time away from the others. There's something I haven't told the group, she said low. I'm telling you because you're going to be right next to me on that far position, and if it goes wrong, you need to know. Ethan's stomach tightened. Ma'am. The far enemy position. Number 4, 2,400 meters. She looked at him steadily. Halverson's imagery analysis came back an hour ago with something she didn't put in the group brief because it would have rattled people who don't need rattling. The shooter in position 4 isn't just good. They've identified his gear, his positioning, his patterns off 6 days of overhead surveillance. She paused. It's the same signature as a shooter we've crossed before. A very, very good one. The kind of shooter who reads 3 wines too. The words hit Ethan like cold water. You're saying position 4 is... I'm saying that the hardest shot on the mountain is also being made by the one enemy up there who might be able to read us the way we read them, Sarah said quietly. Which means position 4 isn't just a long shot in bad wind. It's the one position where if we miss the man on the other end, doesn't just duck. He shoots back. And he doesn't miss twice. She held his eyes. That's the real reason I put you and me on it, Sergeant. Not because it's the longest shot, because it's the one that shoots back. And I wasn't going to put anybody there but myself and the one person on this range I trust to keep thinking when the shooting goes both directions. Ethan Brooks stood very still. The weight of it settled onto him, and it was enormous. And underneath the fear, there was something else, something he hadn't expected. It was pride. Not the loud, brittle kind Colonel Donovan had worn all morning, the quiet kind. The kind that comes from being chosen honestly for the hardest thing by someone who does not lie to make you feel better. Then we'd better not miss twice, ma'am, he said. For the first time, Sarah Mitchell smiled at him, a real one, small and tired and warm. No, she said, we'd better not. She glanced up at the sky where the first hint of dusk was bleeding into the west. Get your kit. Get water into you. Sit down somewhere quiet for 20 minutes and think about anything but this. That's an order, and it's the most important one I'll give you today, because the mind that goes on to that ridge fresh shoots better than the one that spent 4 hours grinding itself down with fear. Ethan nodded and started to turn away. Sergeant, he stopped. Sarah was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. This morning when the colonel threw me off this range and called me a tourist, she said, you know why I walked over to answer your question out of everyone here? No, ma'am. Because you were the only person on this entire range who looked at me like I might know something, she said. 40 of the best operators in the country, and every one of them wrote me off the second the colonel did because he had rank and I didn't in that moment. Except you. You looked at me watching the wind, and instead of deciding I was nobody, you got curious about what I was seeing. She paused. That's not a shooting skill, Sergeant. That's a character. And character is the only thing that survives contact with a night like the one we're about to have. Remember that wherever this goes. She turned and walked toward the tent, leaving Ethan Brooks standing alone in the fading light with his heart full and his mind clear and, for the first time since dawn, completely unafraid. Across the range, Colonel Richard Donovan watched the 7 of them prepare, watched the woman he'd humiliated move among them with the easy authority he'd spent 40 years pretending to have, and understood at last, and too late, the difference between the thing he'd been chasing his whole career and the thing he'd thrown off his range that morning. He did not approach them. He had lost the right. He simply watched, and in the watching, something in him that had been rigid for a very long time began quietly to break. At 1900 hours exactly, two helicopters rose off the desert floor into the darkening sky, carrying 7 shooters toward a mountain where a wounded man lay in a cave with an empty canteen waiting to find out whether his country had forgotten him. And in the lead aircraft, Ethan Brooks looked across the dim cabin at Sarah Mitchell, who sat with her eyes closed and her breathing slow, calm as still water, and he closed his own eyes and matched his breathing to hers and let the mountain come. The helicopter set them down in a dry riverbed 10 kilometers from the mountain at 2100 hours, and the rotors were gone almost before their boots hit the ground, swallowed by the dark in the distance. Then there was only silence and the cold and 7 people standing in hostile country with a job to do. Sarah gathered them close with a hand signal, and when she spoke, it was barely above a breath. From here we go quiet. No voices unless it's life or death. We move by hand and by rope, 10 clicks uphill in the dark, and we have to be in our firing positions and settled with 2 hours of light left to spare before dawn, because a cold shooter shoots better than a rushed one. She looked at each of them. Coleman, you break trail, you've got the best legs. Trenrear security. Brooks, you're on me. Everybody drinks water now because in 4 hours you'll be too focused to remember and a dehydrated brain reads wind wrong. Go. They went. The climb was the hardest physical thing Ethan Brooks had ever done, and he'd done plenty. 10 kilometers up a mountain in full kit in the dark in silence with a rifle that felt heavier every hour and a mission that pressed down on him harder than the pack. But the strange thing, the thing he would remember, was that his mind stayed clear the whole way. Because Sarah had taught him something in one day that a career hadn't, that fear was just energy, and you could either let it shake your hands, or you could pour it into your legs, and your eyes, and your patience. So he poured it into the climb, and he watched Sarah move ahead of him in the dark, sure-footed and silent, as her call sign promised, and he matched her step for step. They lost time twice. Once to a patrol road they hadn't expected, where they lay, flat in the rocks for 40 minutes, while headlights crawled past below them, and Ethan's whole body went rigid until Sarah's hand found his shoulder in the dark and squeezed once slow, telling him without words to breathe, to wait, that this was normal, that the smart thing was patience. The lights passed, they moved on. The second time cost them worse. At around 0100, Vasquez went down hard on loose rock, and the sound of it, the scrape and the small grunt he couldn't quite swallow, froze all 7 of them in place. They waited 5 minutes. 10. Nothing stirred on the mountain above them, but when Vasquez tried to stand, his ankle folded, and Ethan saw the flash of pain cross the man's face in the starlight, and he saw something worse cross it right after. The knowledge that he might have just become a problem. Sarah was beside Vasquez in an instant. She checked the ankle with quick, sure hands, and Ethan watched her face in the dark, watched her make a decision he was glad he didn't have to make. Rolled, not broken, she breathed, but it's swelling. Vasquez, straight answer, and I need the truth, not the answer you think I want. Can you make the position, and can you shoot from it once you're there? Vasquez was quiet for a long moment. Ethan could see what it cost him, the war between pride and honesty. I can make the position, Vasquez whispered finally. Slow, but I can make it. And once I'm down behind the rifle, the ankle doesn't matter. But if we have to run out of here fast, ma'am, carrying a wounded man. He stopped. I'll slow you down. I won't lie to you about that. Sarah nodded slowly. It was Ethan understood exactly the answer she'd wanted because it was the true one, and she'd chosen these 7 precisely because they'd tell her the truth about their own failures. Then here's what we do, she said. You still shoot. Position 3 with Reyes like we planned. Your ankle's got hours to settle before it matters, and you're right behind the rifle, it doesn't. But on the way out, you're not carrying the operative and you're not covering the rear. You get yourself down that mountain, and you don't apologize for it. A shooter who tells me the truth about his ankle is worth more to me than one who hides it and collapses at the wrong moment. You did exactly right. Now get up. We're moving. Ethan watched Vasquez get up, watched the man's face change from shame to something steadier, and he understood he'd just seen leadership do a thing that rank could never do. She hadn't punished the honesty. She'd rewarded it, and in rewarding it, she'd guaranteed that every other person on that mountain would tell her the truth too, when the truth got expensive. He filed it away. He was collecting these lessons now one by one, a whole education compressed into a single terrible night. They reached the ridge at 0300. Sarah split them off in pairs and singles, each to their assigned firing position, with a series of hand signals and a final touch on each shoulder as they peeled away into the dark. Coleman and Tran to the near pair, Reyes and the limping Vasquez to position 3, and Sarah and Ethan kept climbing higher and higher to the far position that looked across the Black Valley at enemy number 4, the one that shot back. When they finally settled into the rocks and Ethan got his first look through his scope at the opposing ridge, his blood ran cold. 2,400 meters away, across a valley full of moving air, he couldn't yet read. He could just make out the enemy position. And in the green wash of his night optic, he could see the shooter. A prone figure behind a long rifle, utterly still, patient in exactly the way Sarah was patient. A professional, a mirror. The one man on the mountain who could do to Ethan and Sarah what they'd come to do to him. "You see him?" Sarah breathed beside him. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Look at how he's set up. Look at how still he is. Look at how he's read his own ground." She was quiet a moment. "That's a shooter who's every bit as good as we are, maybe better. I want you to look at him, and I want you to feel the fear that's rising in you right now, and then I want you to set it down, because we don't have room for it up here." "Can you do that?" Ethan looked at the mirror across the valley, and he felt the fear, and then slowly, the way she'd taught him, he set it down. "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Now we work. We've got 3 hours to read this wind before we can shoot, and this valley is going to lie to us the whole time. Let's start learning its lies." For the next 3 hours in the killing cold before dawn, Sarah Mitchell taught Ethan Brooks to read a mountain. It was nothing like the range. The range had been a classroom. This was the real thing, and the real thing was infinitely worse. The wind in the valley didn't just come in 3 layers. It breathed, rising as pockets of air warmed and sank as they cooled, curling around the ridges, funneling through the gaps, reversing on itself without warning. Sarah showed him how to read it off the faint movement of scrub on the far slopes, off the drift of their own breath, off the way the stars shimmered near the horizon where the air was thickest. She made him call the winds out loud in a whisper over and over, building the same automatic reed he'd built on the range, but harder, deeper, until it lived below thought. And all the while, the clock ran, and somewhere below and to their left in a cave on the same mountain, a man named Cardinal lay in the dark with an empty canteen, and every hour that passed was an hour he might not have. Ethan thought about him. He couldn't help it. "Ma'am," he whispered during a lull. "The operative, Cardinal. You ever meet him?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. "No," she said, "but I know men like him. Men who go into places like this alone with no gun to speak of, no team, nothing but a cover story in their nerve, and do the quiet work that keeps the rest of us from ever having to fight a bigger war. People never hear their names. Nobody puts them on a poster. They disappear into places like this, and sometimes they don't come back, and their own families are told they died in a car accident somewhere boring." Her voice was very low. "That's who's in that cave, Sergeant. A man who gave his whole life to the quiet work, lying up there deciding he's going to make his stand rather than be taken, because he'd rather die than give up what he knows. We are not going to let him die alone up there. That's the whole job. Everything else is just wind." Ethan looked through his scope at the mirror across the valley, and his resolve set like concrete. At 0530, Sarah keyed her radio for the first time all night, one short encrypted burst to the other positions. "All stations, Ghost Echo. Status." The replies came back one by one, whispered tense. "Position 1-2 set, winds read. Ready." That was Coleman and Tran. "Position 3 set, ankles fine behind the gun. Ready." Reyes and Ethan felt a flush of relief that Vasquez had made it. Sarah keyed back. "Position 4 set." She looked at Ethan and he nodded. "All stations. Dawn's the window. We shoot in the last hour of dark when the air is most stable and their thermals are least effective against cold ground. On my count, not before. 4 targets, 4 teams, 1 volley. First round on my mark. If your first shot misses, you have 4 seconds to correct and kill before they go to ground. Nobody shoots early. Nobody shoots late. We live or die together on the timing. Acknowledge." The acknowledgments came back one by one, and then there was nothing to do but wait for the count, and Ethan Brooks lay in the freezing rock beside the most feared sniper alive, staring across 2,400 meters at a man who was at that very moment exactly as still and patient and deadly as he was, and he understood with total clarity that in a very short while one of them was going to kill the other. At 0600, the sky in the east went from black to the faintest gray, and the wind in the valley did something. Sarah caught it before Ethan did. He felt her go still beside him in a new way. "The thermal's shifting early," she breathed. "Dawn's coming faster than the meteorology said. The high wind's picking up. We're losing our window." She was silent for a heartbeat, doing math Ethan couldn't follow. "We shoot in the next 10 minutes, or we don't shoot at all today, and if we don't shoot today, Cardinal doesn't have another day. Stand by." Ethan's heart began to pound. 10 minutes. He forced it slow. "Read, send, watch the trace, one correction, send again." 4 seconds. He said it in his head, below words in his bones. Then at 0607 minutes, everything went wrong. Across the valley, the enemy shooter in position 4 moved. Not much, just a small, deliberate shift of the rifle. But Ethan saw it, and his blood turned to ice because the movement wasn't random. The long barrel was traversing, slowly, deliberately across the valley. Toward them, toward their position. "Ma'am," he breathed, and he heard the fear crack his voice. "He's moving. He's traversing onto us. I think he's seen us." Sarah's voice, when it came, was the calmest thing Ethan had ever heard. Calm the way deep water is calm. "I know," she said. "I see it. Don't move. Don't panic. Listen to me very carefully, Sergeant, because the next 30 seconds decide everything." She never took her eye off her scope. "He hasn't found us. He's found something. A glint, a shape, a wrongness in the rocks that his eye caught the way ours would. He's checking it. If we move now, we confirm it, and he kills whoever moved. If we stay dead still, there's a real chance he decides it's nothing and goes back to watching the quarter. But we can't wait for him to decide because our window is closing and the other 3 positions are waiting on my count." "Then what do we do?" Ethan's whisper was barely sound. "We change the plan," Sarah said. "Right now, and you're going to help me do it, and you're going to stay calm while we do, because a scared shooter is a dead shooter." She keyed her cane with one short whisper. "All stations, ghost echo. Position 4 is compromised. Enemy 4 is traversing onto us. New plan. We shoot now, this instant, on my mark, and I mean the mark comes in about 10 seconds. All positions are you on your targets. Confirm fast." The confirmations came back in a rush of whispers. 1, 2, 3, all on target. "Brooks," Sarah breathed, "here's the change. I can't take enemy 4 and cover you at the same time, and he's about to be looking right down our throats. So we split him. On my mark, you shoot him. Not me, you. I'm going to be your spotter, and I'm going to call your correction the instant your first round lands, because your first round is going to miss. And we both know it, and that's fine. That's the plan. That's why you're here. You shoot, I read the trace, I give you one number, you send the second round, and you kill him before he kills us. Can you do that?" The world narrowed down to a single point. Ethan Brooks, 4 hours removed from hitting 3 out of 10 on a training range, was being asked to win a duel at 2,400 meters against the best enemy shooter on the mountain in shifting dawn wind, with his life and Sarah's and Cardinal's all resting on whether he could put a second bullet into a moving problem in 4 seconds. And the strange thing, the thing that saved him, was that he wasn't afraid anymore. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I can do that." "I know you can," Sarah said. "That's why you're here. Settle, breathe, read your winds. All 3. Weigh the high one heaviest it's picking up hold, about a body width more left than you think. Trust me on that number." She pressed her eye to her spotting optic. Across the valley, the enemy barrel kept traversing closer and closer to their line, a slow, inevitable swing that would in seconds put its muzzle looking directly at them. "All stations," Sarah breathed into the radio. "Stand by." Ethan settled into the rifle. The whole night, the whole day before it, the whole climb, the whole education, all of it funneled down into this. He found his 3 wins. He read the valley the way she'd taught him. He held a body width left of the still moving figure across the impossible distance. He let his breath go halfway out and stopped. His heart impossibly was slow. Across the valley, the enemy shooter's barrel came to a stop, pointed directly at them. "He's on us," Sarah breathed. "Mark." Ethan Brooks squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, and the round was gone, screaming across 2,400 meters of shifting dark air. And in that instant, every other position on the ridge fired too, 4 rifles speaking almost as one across the valley, and the whole mountain seemed to hold its breath. An eternity passed in the space of a second and a half. "Miss," Sarah said instantly, her voice flat and fast and utterly without panic. "Low left half a meter. The high wind stronger than I called. Come up one hold, a hand width right of your first hold. Send it now, Brooks." Now. And Ethan Brooks did not panic. He did not chase the miss. He did not freeze. Everything she drilled into him took over below thought in his bones. He read what the trace had told him. He made one deliberate correction up one day hand width right. And in the space of a heartbeat, while the enemy shooter across the valley was still processing the crack of Ethan's first round, splitting the air past him, still just beginning to react, Ethan Brooks sent his second round. "Read, send, watch the trace, one correction, send again." 4 seconds, the bullet crossed the valley. "Hit," Sarah breathed. "Center, he's down. Brooks, he's down, you got him. You got him." Down the ridge, the reports came flooding into her radio in a rush of tight whispers. "Position 1 target down. Position 2 down. Position 3 enemy 3 down confirmed. 4 enemy positions, 4 kills. In a single volley across a valley full of lying wind in the last gray minutes before dawn. The corridor was open. For one long moment, nobody moved, and the only sound on the whole mountain was the wind Ethan had finally learned to read. He lay behind his rifle with his heart still impossibly slow, staring across the valley at the still figure of the man he'd just beaten in a duel he had no business winning, and he felt no triumph. He felt only a vast quiet gravity, the weight of what he'd just done and what it had bought. Sarah's hand came down on his shoulder and squeezed once slow. That, she breathed, was the shot you couldn't make yesterday morning. Nothing changed but what you were willing to see and who you were willing to become. She was already moving, already keying her radio, already thinking 3 steps ahead. But we don't get to feel anything about it yet. The corridor is open, and that means the clock just started on the hardest part. All stations ghost echo. Overwatch neutralized. Corridor is open. Move to the extraction plan. We go get our man, now. And Ethan Brooks pulled his eye from the scope and looked down the mountain toward the cave where a man named Cardinal lay in the dark with an empty canteen, not yet knowing that his country had just fought its way through the night to reach him and that the door was finally impossibly open. They came down off the ridge, fast-moving now in the gray half-light with the corridor open beneath them, and every second counted because an open door does not stay open forever. Sarah led Ethan close behind her, and the others converged from their positions to form up at the mouth of the extraction corridor, 7 shooters becoming one team again, funneling down toward the cave where Cardinal waited. "Talk to me, all stations," Sarah breathed as they moved. "Casualties, ammo, status." "Position 1-2 clean moving to link up," Coleman answered. "Position 3. A pause, and Ethan heard the strain in Reyes's voice. "Vasquez is mobile, but the ankle's worse coming down than it was going up. We're slow. We'll make the link, but we're the slow element." "Copy position 3. Everybody adjust to Vasquez's pace on the exfil. Nobody leaves him. That was never the plan, and it isn't now." Sarah's voice never wavered. "Brooks, you're with me. We push ahead to the cave and make contact with Cardinal while the rest form the corridor security. A wounded man who's been alone 6 days doesn't know we're friendly until he sees our faces, and a scared man with nothing left to lose is dangerous. I've had operatives point weapons at their own rescuers. Let's not get shot by the man we came to save." They reached the cave at 0640. Sarah stopped Ethan with a hand 20 meters out in the last of the rocks. She studied the dark mouth of the cave for a long moment, reading it the way she read everything patient and complete. "Cardinal," she called out low but clear in English. "United States. We're the ones you called. We're coming in. Don't shoot. You're going home." For a long, terrible moment, there was nothing, only silence from the dark mouth of the cave. And Ethan felt his heart climb into his throat because the silence could mean anything. It could mean the man was asleep or unconscious or aiming or dead. 6 days with a ruined leg and an empty canteen. Anything. Then a voice came out of the cave. Cracked dry, barely a voice at all, wrecked by days of thirst and cold and pain. But alive. "Prove it," the voice rasped. "Anybody can say United States. Prove it or I start shooting, and I don't much care anymore who I hit." Sarah didn't hesitate. "Your last transmission was 11 hours ago," she called. "You said legs bad, can't run anymore. This is where I make my stand. Dr. Halverson's been running your picture since you went dark. She hasn't slept in 3 days. She's the one who found this cave off your beacon. Nobody knows those words but you, her, and the 7 of us who climbed this mountain in the dark to come get you. Now put the weapon down, Cardinal. We fought all night to reach you. Don't make the last thing that happens up here be you shooting the people who came for you. Another silence. Shorter this time. Then from the dark, a sound Ethan would remember for the rest of his life. It was a broken, choking exhale, half sob and half laugh. The sound of a man who had spent 6 days certain he was going to die alone in a hole on a mountain, suddenly discovering he was wrong. Come in, Cardinal rasped. Oh God, come in. I put it down. Come in. They went in. Cardinal was in worse shape than the brief had prepared them for. He was propped against the cave wall with a pistol lying beside his hand exactly where he'd set it down. His leg was a wreck, splinted with a broken rifle stock and torn strips of his own clothing, swollen and wrong. His lips were cracked and bleeding. His eyes were sunk deep in his skull. He'd been rationing 30 seconds of water a day out of a canteen that had run dry sometime yesterday, and he'd kept moving and kept hiding and kept his weapon ready for 6 days on a shattered leg alone, because that was the work, and he was a professional to the marrow. But when he saw their faces when the reality of rescue finally reached him, the professional broke just for a second, and Ethan watched tears cut clean tracks down the dirt on the man's face. You came, Cardinal whispered. I told myself you would. 6 days, I told myself. But last night I stopped believing it. I stopped believing it, and I decided I'd make them pay for me instead of getting taken, and I set my pistol on my chest and you came anyway. Sarah dropped to her knees beside him and had water at his lips before he'd finished the sentence. Small sips, she said, and her voice, which had been steel all night, was suddenly gentle in a way that startled Ethan. Slow, I know you want to drink the whole thing. Small sips or you'll bring it right back up. She got water into him a little at a time, and while she did, she talked to him low and steady, the way you'd talk to a frightened animal or a frightened child. You did everything right. You hear me? 6 days on that leg alone weapon, ready moving at night. That's not surviving, Cardinal, that's fighting. You fought for 6 days. Now let us do the fighting for a while. Your job is done. You just have to hold on and let us carry you home. Ethan knelt on the man's other side, and Cardinal's hands shot out and gripped his forearm with a strength that was shocking in a body that wrecked. Who are you? Cardinal rasped, staring at him. Staff Sergeant Ethan Brooks, sir. Army. Ethan Brooks. Cardinal's cracked lips pulled into something like a smile. I'm going to remember that name. Every day I have left, however many that is, I'm going to remember the names of the people who climbed a mountain for a man they never met. His grip tightened. Why? Why'd you come? You don't know me. Nobody knows me. That's the whole point of what I do. So why? Ethan looked at the wrecked, weeping, unbreakable man gripping his arm, and the answer came up out of him without thought. Because nobody gets left behind, sir, he said. That's the whole reason. That's the only reason there needs to be. Behind him, Ethan heard Sarah go very still, and he realized he'd said her exact words back to a dying man, without knowing it, the words she'd said on the range a lifetime ago, and that they were true, and that he believed them now in a way he never had before this night. The moment didn't last. It couldn't. Sarah was already moving, already back to steel, because sentiment was a luxury, and the clock was running. Brooks splint, check. I need that leg stabilized for movement. We're going to have to carry him, and it's going to hurt him worse than anything's hurt him yet. She keyed her radio. All stations, ghost echo. Cardinal is secure alive, dehydrated, non-ambulatory. Repeat, he cannot walk. We carry him out. Form the corridor. Coleman, I need a litter rigged in 90 seconds. Use the poles in the Sked 50. Reyes, where's my security? Corridor set, ghost echo, Reyes answered. But we've got a problem. His voice dropped. Movement in the low ground. Vehicles. Halverson's people are calling it. They picked up on overhead. The 4 sniper teams going quiet on the net woke somebody up. There's a reaction force spinning up in the valley below us, and they're moving toward the base of this mountain. We've got maybe 40 minutes before they're on the lower slopes. The tent back on the range felt very far away, and General Anderson's grim answer to Vasquez about the odds felt very close. Ethan looked at Sarah. She didn't flinch. She never flinched. But he saw her do the math behind her eyes, the same fast, merciless arithmetic she'd done all night, and he saw the answer come up ugly. 40 minutes to get a non-ambulatory man down a mountain that took us 6 hours to climb, she said flatly. That math doesn't work, so we're not going to do that math. She keyed the radio. Halverson Ghost Echo, I need exfil options that aren't the route we came in on. Talk to me. There was a pause full of static, and then Halverson's voice tight and fast. Ghost Echo, stand by. Working it. A longer pause. Then, okay, there's a shelf, 2 clicks northeast of your position downslope on the far side of the ridge from the reaction force. It's flat enough and clear enough for a helicopter to get 1 wheel down for a hot extraction. But Ghost Echo, listen. To reach it, you have to cross an open saddle. 200 meters of ground with no cover in daylight, and if that reaction force gets a spotter onto the high ground before you cross it, they can range you the whole way. It's a shooting gallery, that's the option. It's a bad one. Sarah didn't hesitate for even a second. We'll take it. Send the bird. Give me a time on target. Bird's already spinning. Anderson launched it the second the overwatch went down. Time on target to the shelf, 25 minutes. Copy 25 minutes. Sarah looked at her team, all of them gathered now in and around the cave, mouthed 7 shooters and 1 wrecked operative, and she laid it out fast. Here's the picture. We've got a reaction force coming up from the valley and a helicopter coming for us at a shelf 2 clicks northeast. To make the bird, we cross an open saddle, 200 meters, no cover. If the enemy gets a shooter onto the high ground behind us before we're across, they'll cut us to pieces in the open, and we'll be carrying a man who can't run. She paused. So we don't all cross at once. We leapfrog. Some of us cross with Cardinal while the rest hold the high ground behind us and keep any enemy shooter's head down. Then the ones holding cross last under our cover from the far side. It's the same as this morning, just closer and faster in both directions. We cover each other across or nobody gets across. Everybody understand. They understood. Coleman Tranreyes, you're the first cover element, you hold the high ground, and you keep that saddle clean while we move Cardinal. Vasquez, bad ankle, you cross first with the litter team. You're no good holding a position you can't move off of. Brooks, she looked at him. You and me hold last. We're the best 2 shooters here, and we've got the best eyes for the high ground. When everybody else is across, we cross under nobody's cover but our own speed. That's the hard job, again. That's why it's us again. Ethan met her eyes and nodded. Of course it was them. It was always going to be them. They rigged the litter, they got Cardinal onto it, and the man bit down on a strip of leather and didn't scream when they moved his ruined leg. Though Ethan saw the whites of his eyes and the sweat break across his gray face, and he thought that was maybe the bravest thing he'd seen all night, and he'd seen a lot. At 0710 they moved. The 2 clicks to the saddle went faster than the climb all down hill, but every meter of it was agony for Cardinal and tension for the rest, because now the light was full, and the mountain that had hidden them all night hid them no longer. Twice Sarah stopped them cold in the rocks while she read the slopes below, hunting for the first sign of the reaction force gaining the high ground. Twice she found nothing and moved them on. They reached the near edge of the open saddle at 0728. The bird was 7 minutes out, and that was when Sarah, scanning the high ground one last time, went still in the particular way that Ethan had learned to dread. We've got a spotter, she breathed. High ground or left, maybe 1,200 meters. 1 man, he's got optics up, and he's looking right at the saddle. He's the eyes for the reaction force. And the second we start across that open ground, he calls it, and then everybody with a rifle down in that valley knows exactly where we are and exactly where we're going. She was quiet for a heartbeat. He hasn't seen us yet. We're still in the rocks. But the moment the litter team steps into the open, he will. Ethan looked at the enemy spotter through his own scope. 1,200 meters. A hard shot, but not an impossible one, not after the night they'd had, not after 2,400 meters in the dark. But there was a problem, and Sarah said it before he could. If we shoot him, the shot itself tells the valley we're here, she said. A rifle report from up high, a spotter suddenly going dark. They'll know exactly what happened and roughly where. Either way, the second we deal with him, the clock goes from 40 minutes to about 4, so we don't shoot him until the last possible instant. We wait until the litter team is committed to the crossing, and then you and I drop that spotter in the same breath the team steps into the open so he never gets the chance to call it. He has to die in the first second before he keys his radio, or all of this was for nothing. She looked at him. You take him. I spot. Same as this morning. Can you make 1,200 cold first round, no second chances? Because a second round means he lived long enough to talk. The whole mission had narrowed once again to a single shot that Ethan Brooks had to make. And once again, he wasn't afraid. Yes, ma'am, he said. First round. Sarah keyed the radio, barely a breath. All stations. Enemy spotter high ground, our left, 1,200. Brooks takes him on my mark the instant the litter team commits to the crossing. Litter team, when I say go, you move, and you do not stop for anything until you're across, because the whole plan is that Brooks kills the spotter before he can report you, and if you hesitate in the open, you die. Understand? Litter team copies. Ready on your go. Ethan settled into his rifle. He found the spotter 1,200 meters away, a patient man doing his patient job exactly the way the man across the valley had been doing his a few hours before. He read the wind, the morning winds lighter now than the dawn duel, but still layered, still lying. He held. His heart was slow. Sarah pressed her eye to her optic. Litter team, she breathed. On 3. Brooks, you fire on go, not before. 1, 2. A held breath. 3. Go. The litter team broke from the rocks and stepped into the open saddle, Cardinal between them. 200 meters of naked ground stretching ahead and across the mountain. The enemy spotter's head came up, his hand moving toward his radio, his mouth opening to call the sighting that would kill them all. Mark, Sarah breathed. Ethan Brooks squeezed the trigger. The round crossed 1,200 meters of morning air. Down, Sarah said one flat word. He never keyed it. Litter team, keep moving. You're clean. Go, go, go. The spotter had died with his hand on his radio and the warning still in his throat. And the litter team was already halfway across the saddle, moving fast and low, with Cardinal between them. And for a few seconds, the whole desperate gamble was working. The whole impossible plan was holding together. And then at 0732, the mountain below them came alive with the sound Ethan had been dreading all morning. Distant, but not distant enough. The flat rolling crackle of gunfire rising up from the valley as the reaction force. Hearing Ethan's single shot echo off the high ground, understood at last that their prey was on the move and began to climb. They heard it, Sarah said, calm as ever, already reading the new problem. That's fine, that was always going to happen. That's why we timed it to the crossing. The litter team's across, or almost. Brooks watched the low ground, call me anything that shows itself. We cover the last elements across, and then it's you and me and the bird. She keyed the radio. Coleman Reyes, Tran high ground element, break and cross. Now Brooks and I have you covered. From here, move. The cover element broke from their positions and ran for the saddle, and Ethan lay beside Sarah and watched the low ground with everything he had, and when a shape appeared at the edge of the rocks below a lead element of the reaction force, gaining the slope faster than anyone had hoped, he called it, and Sarah put a round into it without a flicker, and the shape went down, and the others behind it went to ground, buying seconds. Precious seconds, the difference between everyone living and everyone dying, measured in single heartbeats. The cover element made the far side. 6 of the 7 were across now, and Cardinal with them. Only Ethan and Sarah remained on the near high ground, holding while the reaction force massed in the rocks below, and the helicopter came screaming in over the far ridge toward the shelf. Birds on final? Halverson's voice crackled. 1 minute. Ghost Echo, they can only hold that shelf for about 90 seconds before it's too hot. You have to be moving to it now. Copy 1 minute. Sarah looked at Ethan. This is the part where you and I run 200 meters across open ground with no cover, while an angry reaction force shoots at our backs, and we don't stop and we don't look back, and we trust the rest of the team to cover us from the far side, the way we just covered them. Can you run, Sergeant? Ethan's heart was pounding, but not with fear, with something clean and bright and enormous. Yes, ma'am. Then on my go we go, and we do not stop for anything. Not for a stumble, not for a near miss, not for each other. If one of us goes down, the other keeps running, and the team comes back for the one who fell. That's the rule. That's the only rule. Nobody dies trying to be a hero on 200 meters of open ground. Say you understand it. I understand it, he looked at her, but I'm not leaving you if you go down, ma'am, just so we're clear. For one instant in the middle of all of it, Sarah Mitchell looked at him, and something moved across her face that he'd never seen there. Something that in another life might have been a mother looking at a son. "I know you're not," she said quietly. "That's the whole problem with the ones worth saving." "All right, Sergeant." She gathered herself. "On three, 1, 2, 3, run." And they ran. They came up out of the rocks and into the open saddle, two figures sprinting across 200 meters of naked ground, and behind them the reaction force gained the high ground they just left and opened up, and the air around them came alive with the crack and snap of rounds. And from the far side of the saddle, the rest of the team opened up and returned Coleman and Reyes and Tran and even Vasquez, firing over their heads to drive the enemy down a wall of covering fire that turned the 200 meters from certain death into merely almost certain death. Ethan ran. He'd never run like it, would never run like it again. Beside him, Sarah ran, and the ground kicked up around them, and the helicopter flared over the shelf ahead with its ramp down and hands reaching out, and Cardinal wrecked, Cardinal propped in the open door, screaming at them to run, run, run. The man they'd climbed a mountain to save now, screaming his cracked voice raw to bring them home. 100 meters, 50, the rounds snapping past, the teams covering fire, hammering the ridge behind them. And then the shelf and the ramp and hands grabbing them and hauling them bodily into the shaking metal belly of the helicopter. And Sarah Mitchell's voice even now, even here, cutting through the chaos with a single command as the bird lurched up off the shelf into open air. "Go, go, we're all on, get us out. Everybody's on, go." The helicopter clawed into the sky and the mountain fell away below them, and the gunfire faded, and then there was only the roar of the engines and 8 impossible survivors packed into the shaking cabin, and a wrecked operative named Cardinal weeping openly, now with his hand locked around Ethan Brooks's forearm, and the most feared sniper alive sitting back at last against the cold metal wall with her eyes closed and her breathing finally going slow. They had done it. Against every honest number General Anderson had given them, they had climbed the mountain, opened the quarter, reached the man in the cave, and carried him home. Ethan Brooks looked down at Cardinal's hand gripping his arm, and then across the cabin at Sarah, and he understood that the young man who'd hit 3 out of 10 on a training range 24 hours ago no longer existed, and that whoever he was now had been forged somewhere on that mountain in the dark, in the space between a first shot that missed and a second shot that didn't, and that he would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of the woman who had seen it in him before he'd seen it in himself. The helicopter carried them out of the mountains as the sun climbed, and for the first 20 minutes, nobody in the cabin said a word. They were all just breathing. 8 people who had walked into a place designed to kill them and walk back out, packed shoulder to shoulder, in the shaking metal belly of the aircraft, still not quite believing they were alive to feel it. Cardinal was the first to break the silence. He hadn't let go of Ethan's arm the whole flight, and now, with water in him and the mountain finally behind them, some of the wreckage in his face had eased into something else. "I need you to understand something," he rasped, looking around at all of them, at Sarah and Ethan and Coleman and Reyes and Tran and Vasquez and the 2 others. 6 days I was up there, and the thing that breaks you isn't the leg. It isn't the thirst. It's the arithmetic. Every hour you do the math on your own rescue, and every hour the number gets worse, and eventually the number becomes 0. Last night my number hit 0. I set my pistol on my chest, and I made my peace. His cracked voice thickened. "And then you came anyway. After my number was already 0, you came anyway. There is no thank you for that. There's no words for that. I just need you to know that I know exactly what you did, and I will carry it every single day I have left." Sarah opened her eyes and looked at him from across the cabin. "You don't owe us anything, Cardinal," she said. "That's the part people never understand about this. You already paid. You paid for 6 days alone on a mountain, doing the quiet work that keeps the rest of the country safe and never once gets to say so out loud. We just came to collect you and bring you home because that's the deal. That's always been the deal. You go into the dark for us, we come into the dark for you. Nobody gets left behind." She paused. "You'd have done it for any one of us, so there's no debt, there's just the deal kept." Cardinal looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded slowly, and something in him seemed finally to let go, and he sagged back against the cabin wall and closed his eyes, and for the first time in 6 days, the man slept without one hand on a weapon. Ethan watched him sleep, and then he looked at Sarah, and he had 1,000 questions, and he asked only one. Ma'am, is it always like that? The math hitting zero. Sarah was quiet for a while. For the man in the cave, yeah, she said finally. Always, that's the job we do, Sergeant. We show up after the math hits zero. We're the number that isn't supposed to exist. That's the whole point of us. She looked at him. And here's the thing I need you to understand, because you're one of us now, whether you meant to be or not. Every man we pull out of a hole like that, we pull out because somebody somewhere refused to accept the arithmetic, refused to write him off. The whole machine that saved Cardinal today started with one analyst named Halverson, who wouldn't sleep because she wouldn't quit on a signal, and it ran through 7 shooters who wouldn't quit on a course. They had all failed, and it ended with one man who wouldn't quit after his first shot missed at 2,400 meters in the dark. She held his eyes. It ended with you. Cardinal's alive because a staff sergeant who hit 3 out of 10 yesterday morning refused to panic when his first round missed. Never forget that's what saved him. Not the perfect shot. The refusal to quit after the imperfect one. Ethan Brooks looked down at his own hands, the hands that had made that shot, and he understood that Sarah was giving him something he'd carry for the rest of his life, and he took it and he held on to it. They landed back at the staging base a little after 0900. The moment the ramp came down, medical personnel swarmed the aircraft and took Cardinal, and there was a chaotic few minutes of stretchers and IVs and shouted status, and then the wrecked operative was gone, wheeled away toward a surgical tent where the doctors would confirm hours later, keep his leg and his life both. And the 7 shooters climbed down out of the helicopter onto solid ground and stood there in the morning light, filthy and hollow-eyed and alive, not quite knowing what to do with themselves now that the thing was done. Lieutenant General Michael Anderson was waiting for them on the tarmac. He didn't say anything at first. He walked down the line of them, slowly looking each one in the face. Coleman, Tran, Reyes, Vasquez limping. The 2 others, Ethan, and finally Sarah. And when he reached the end of the line, he stepped back and did something Ethan had only seen him do once before 24 hours ago on a firing range. He came to attention and he saluted them. All of them. I have read a great many after-action reports in 35 years, Anderson said, holding the salute. I have never in my career expected to write the one I'm about to write. 4 enemy overwatch positions eliminated in a single volley across a valley at ranges up to 2,400 meters in mountain wind in the dark. A non-ambulatory operative extracted under fire from a hot shelf with a reaction force on your backs. 0 friendly casualties. He lowered the salute. There are people at every level of this government who will tell you for the rest of your lives that what you did last night was not possible. You will not be able to correct them because most of what happened up there will never be unclassified. You will have to carry it in silence. He looked at them. But I was here. I read the traffic in real time. I heard the shots go down over the net. And I will know until the day I die that 7 people the system had already labeled failures walked into an impossible place and brought an American home. That's the truest thing I know. Now go get some sleep. You've earned a decade of it. The team began to break apart, then drifting toward the tents and the promise of water and rest, and Ethan lingered watching them go, and he saw Coleman, the big ranger who had shot first and missed on the range stop in front of Sarah. Ma'am, Coleman said, and the big man's voice was rough. I want to say something, and I want to say it right. Yesterday morning, I put 2 rounds out of 8 on target, and I thought I'd embarrassed myself in front of the whole community. I spent the whole afternoon sick about it, ashamed. He shook his head. And then you told me the score didn't matter, that you were watching what I did after I missed. I didn't understand it then. He looked at her. I understand it now. You saw something in a man who just failed that the man couldn't see in himself. And because you did, I'm standing here alive. And so is that operative. I've served under a lot of leaders, ma'am. I never served under one who could do that. Thank you. Sarah gripped his shoulder. You didn't fail yesterday, Coleman, she said. You just met a course built by someone who lied to you about the wind. And when you found out you'd been lied to, you didn't get bitter and you didn't quit. You got to work. That's not a man who failed. That's a man I'd follow up any mountain there is. She squeezed once and let go. Go sleep. One by one, they thanked her in their own rough ways. These hard men who did not thank anyone easily. And one by one, she gave each of them back some piece of themselves they hadn't known they'd lost. And Ethan watched all of it and understood that he was watching the thing itself, the real thing, the thing Colonel Donovan had chased his whole career with rank and volume and pride, and never once come close to. Leadership, not the kind that commands, the kind that sees. And then, as if the thought had summoned him, there was Colonel Donovan. He came across the tarmac slowly, and he looked like a different man than the one who'd stood at the head of a firing line 24 hours ago. The rigidity was gone out of him. The pride that had held him upright for 40 years had been knocked out from under him, and what was left was just a tired old soldier walking toward a woman he'd wronged, not knowing if he had any right to. The team went quiet as he approached. Ethan felt the temperature of the moment change. These were men who'd heard exactly what Donovan had done, how he'd thrown Ghost Echo off the range and called her a tourist, and there was no warmth in the looks they gave him now. Donovan stopped in front of Sarah. For a long moment, he couldn't seem to find any words. When they finally came, they came hard, dragged up from somewhere deep. "Senior Chief," he said, "I owe you an apology. And an apology isn't enough, and I know it isn't, but it's what I've got, so I'm going to give it to you, and I'm going to give it to you in front of these men, because I insulted you in front of these men, and it's only right that I take it back the same way." He swallowed. "Yesterday I looked at you, and I saw a civilian. I saw a woman in street clothes with an old rifle case, and I decided in about 2 seconds that I knew everything I needed to know about you, and I was wrong about every single thing. You were the most capable person on that range, and I threw you off it. I lectured you about weakness. I lectured you." His voice cracked. "40 years I've worn this uniform, and I have never been more ashamed of anything than I am of what I did to you yesterday. I'm sorry, that's all. I'm just sorry." The tarmac was silent. Everyone waited to see what Ghost Echo would do. She had every right to break him. He'd earned it. One cold sentence, and she could put 40 years of a proud man's career in the dirt, where in the eyes of most of the men standing there, it belonged. Sarah Mitchell looked at Colonel Donovan for a long moment. "Colonel," she said, "you want to know what your real mistake was yesterday? It wasn't that you looked at me and saw a civilian. Anybody can misjudge a stranger. That's human." She paused. "Your mistake was that when I handed you sealed orders, you didn't read them. You had the answer to your misjudgment right there in your hand in an envelope, and your pride wouldn't let you open it because opening it meant admitting you might be wrong about something in front of your men." She held his eyes. "That's the thing that almost cost this mission. Not that you misjudged me, that you'd rather have been wrong than look uncertain. And Colonel, I need you to hear this because there are young men on this tarmac who are watching how this ends. That's the most dangerous thing a leader can be. A leader who would rather be wrong than admit he doesn't know. That's how good men get killed, not by the enemy, by a commander too proud to read the envelope." Donovan flinched with every word, but he took it. He stood there, and he took it, and Ethan realized that was itself a kind of courage to stand and receive the truth you've earned. And then Sarah's voice changed. "But," she said, and the steel softened, "you just walked across this tarmac and apologized to me in front of these men. You took it back the same way you gave it. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How few men who've worn stars and eagles for 40 years can do what you just did?" She shook her head slowly. "Most men, when they're caught being wrong, dig in, they double down. They spend the rest of their careers defending the mistake because admitting it costs too much. You didn't do that. You waited a whole day, watched us fly off towards something you thought might kill us, and then you walked out here in front of everyone and set your pride down on the ground." She paused. "That's the man I wish had shown up on the range yesterday. And Colonel, here's what I want you to understand. That man was in you the whole time. He was just buried under 40 years of learning that rank means never being wrong. It doesn't. It never did. The best leaders I've ever served under were the ones most willing to say, 'I don't know, tell me.' You've got that man in you. I just watched him walk across a tarmac. Don't bury him again." Colonel Richard Donovan stood there with tears standing in his eyes. An old soldier who had come expecting condemnation and been handed instead a way back to himself. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out, and Sarah spared him the need. "There'll be an investigation," she said gently. "The general has to convene one. You interfered with a JSOC operation, and that can't just be waved away, and I won't pretend it can. You may lose your command. But how you carry yourself through that investigation, whether you spend it defending your pride or whether you spend it teaching every young officer who'll listen the lesson you learned yesterday, that's up to you. And that, Colonel, will matter a great deal more than whether you keep the command. She extended her hand. No hard feelings. Life's too short, and this work's too hard to carry them. Donovan looked at her outstretched hand as if it were something holy. Then he took it and gripped it, and Ethan saw a whole day's worth of shame and a whole career's worth of pride finally break and drain out of the man, leaving something humbler and truer behind. "Thank you, Senior Chief," Donovan said hoarsely. "I don't deserve that, but thank you." "None of us deserve half of what we get," Sarah said. "The trick is spending the rest of your life trying to." The investigation came as Sarah had said it would. Colonel Donovan was relieved of command pending its outcome, and in the weeks that followed, the finding was exactly what everyone expected. His interference with a classified JSOC operation could not be excused. But something happened in those weeks that no one expected, least of all Donovan himself. He did exactly what Sarah had told him he could do. He spent the investigation not defending his pride, but dismantling it in front of every board and every officer who'd listen, telling the story of the day. He threw the best shooter alive off his range because he was too proud to read an envelope. He turned his worst day into a lesson, and he taught it without flinching. And by the time the investigation closed, the story of Colonel Donovan had quietly become something else in the community. Not the story of a man who failed, the story of a man who owned it. He did not keep his command, but he kept something Sarah had told him mattered more, and he spent his last years in uniform teaching young officers the one thing rank had never taught him, and there were men who would lead better for the rest of their careers because of it. Ethan Brooks saw him one more time months later at a small ceremony. He wasn't supposed to talk about where a handful of people who couldn't be named received awards that couldn't be publicized for a rescue that officially never happened. Donovan was there in a civilian suit, now retired, and when he saw Ethan across the room, he came over and the two of them stood together for a while without much needing to be said. "You were the one who walked across the range," Donovan said finally. "Weren't you? The young sergeant who went and asked her about the win while I was busy throwing her off my line." "Yes, sir." Donovan nodded slowly. "I saw you do it. I remember thinking there's a kid who doesn't know his place." He gave a rough, rueful laugh. "Turns out you knew exactly where your place was. It was next to her learning, and I was the one who didn't know mine." He looked at Ethan. "She told me something on that tarmac I think about every single day. She said the most dangerous thing a leader can be is someone who'd rather be wrong than admit he doesn't know." He paused. "You remember that, Sergeant? You're going to lead men someday. Probably a lot of them. When you do, you read the envelope. Every time, no matter what it costs your pride, you read the envelope." "I will, sir," Ethan said. "I promise you I will." And he did. For the rest of his career, Ethan Brooks read the envelope. Every time. But that was later. On the morning after the mountain on the tarmac, after Donovan had walked away, a lighter and humbler man, there was one conversation left, and it was the one that mattered most to Ethan, and it was the one he'd remember longest of all. Sarah found him standing alone near the edge of the tarmac, watching the surgical tent, where Cardinal was being put back together, and she came and stood beside him. "You did something last night, Sergeant," she said, "that most shooters go their whole careers without doing. You won a duel at 2,400 meters against a man who was every bit as good as you in the dark, in mountain wind, on your second shot, 4 seconds after your first one missed. Men will tell you for the rest of your life that shot was impossible." She looked at him. "How do you feel about it?" Ethan was quiet for a while. "Honestly, ma'am," he said, "I don't feel proud of it. I keep thinking about the man on the other end. He was patient, and he was still, and he was good exactly like you. In another life, he might have been you or me, and I killed him." He shook his head. "I'd do it again. I'd do it 100 times to save Cardinal. But I don't feel proud, I just feel the weight of it." Sarah nodded slowly, and something in her face told Ethan he'd said the right thing without trying to. "Good," she said quietly. "That's the answer I hoped you'd give, and it's the reason I picked you, and it's the reason you're going to be one of the great ones if you stay in this work. The shooters who feel proud of the kill, who get a thrill off it, they don't last, or worse, they last and turn into something you don't want to be near. The ones who feel the weight, who never stop feeling it, who carry every single one. Those are the ones you want covering you on a ridge in the dark." She paused. "The weight is the point, Sergeant. The day you stop feeling it is the day you need to walk away from this work because that's the day you've become the thing we're supposed to protect people from. Don't ever let the weight go. Carry everyone. It's what keeps you human in an inhuman job. Ethan looked at her. Do you still feel it after all of them? Sarah Mitchell was silent for a long time, looking out at the morning. Every single one, she said finally. Every face. I could tell you about all of them. I've never forgotten a single one, and I never will. And there are nights it's very hard to carry. But I've made my peace with it because here's the thing I finally understood a long way into this work. She turned to face him fully. The weight I carry from every shot I've ever taken, it's the exact same weight as every man I've ever brought home. Cardinal's alive today. He's going to see his family again. That's on the same scale as the man I put down to save him. I carry both. And when I add it all up over a whole career, the scale comes out on the side of the living. Just barely some years, but it comes out on the side of the living. That's what lets me sleep. She paused. You made a choice last night, Ethan. You put a man down so a man in a cave could go home to his family. You will carry that choice forever. But you weigh it against Cardinal weeping on that helicopter, against the family that gets him back. And I promise you the scale comes out on the side of the living. Hold on to that when the nights get hard, because they will. Ethan Brooks stood beside the most feared sniper alive, and he understood that she had just handed him the last and most important lesson of all, the one that had nothing to do with wind or rifles or range, the one about how to stay a whole human being while doing a job that could hollow a man out entirely. And he took it and he held on to it, and it would carry him through a long career and many hard nights, and he would pass it on someday to young shooters of his own, exactly the way she'd passed it to him. Ma'am, he said, can I ask you one last thing? Ask. Yesterday morning before any of this, when the colonel threw you off the range and called you a tourist and you just stepped aside and waited by the SUV, he looked at her. You could have stopped it. One sentence. You could have told him who you were and he'd have fallen all over himself. Why'd you let him do it? Why'd you stand there and take it? Sarah Mitchell smiled, and it was the tired, warm, knowing smile of someone who had learned something the hard way a long time ago and made her peace with it. 2 reasons, she said. The first is that greatness doesn't need to announce itself, Sergeant. The moment you feel like you have to tell people who you are, you've already lost something. The best people I've ever known, the truly dangerous ones, the ones you'd want beside you at the worst moment of your life, they never once told you how good they were. They just were quietly and let the work speak when the work needed to. Loud is what people do when they're not sure. Quiet is what you can afford to be when you know exactly what you can do. She paused. Donovan spent 40 years being loud because somewhere deep down he wasn't sure. I didn't need to be loud because I was sure, so I let him talk. It cost me nothing. And the second reason? Her smile deepened. The second reason is that I was watching the range, and I needed everyone else to be watching the range too and not watching me. If I'd announced myself, every shooter out there would have been performing for Ghost Echo instead of just being themselves, and I'd never have seen the truth of who they were under pressure. Donovan throwing me off that line was the best thing that could have happened because it made me invisible. And invisible is exactly what I needed to be to watch 40 men fail and find out which of them failed the right way. She looked at him. You want to know the moment I picked you, Sergeant? It wasn't when you made the shot last night. It was 24 hours ago when I was standing by that SUV pretending to be nobody, and one young staff sergeant looked across a firing range at a woman everyone else had written off and got curious instead of dismissive. That was it. That was the whole thing. Everything after that was just confirmation. She put her hand on his shoulder one last time. Never lose the curiosity, Ethan. It's rarer than any shot you'll ever make, and it's worth more. The world is full of people who can shoot. It is desperately short of people who, when everyone else has already decided they know the answer, are humble enough to walk across the range and ask the question. She squeezed his shoulder once, and then she let go and she picked up her weathered rifle case from where it sat by her feet, the same case a colonel had told her to pick up and carry off his range a lifetime ago, and she slung it over her shoulder. Get some sleep, Sergeant Brooks, she said. You did good work, the best work there is. You brought a man home. And Senior Chief Sarah Mitchell call sign, Ghost Echo, the most feared and most respected sniper ever to serve, walked away across the tarmac toward whatever came next, quiet and unhurried and entirely sure of herself, exactly as she'd arrived, and Ethan Brooks watched her go and understood that he had been changed forever by 24 hours in the presence of a person who had never once needed to tell anyone who she was. He never forgot her. He never forgot the 3 wins, or the 4-second sequence, or the shot at 2,400 meters, or the weight or the scale that came out on the side of the living. But most of all, for the rest of his life, he never forgot the lesson that had started all of it, the one a proud colonel learned too late and a humble sergeant learned just in time. That rank is not the same thing as respect. That experience means nothing if pride won't let you learn. That the loudest person in the room is almost never the most dangerous one. And that real greatness never has to announce itself because it reveals itself quietly and completely in the calm confidence of someone who walks into an impossible place, does the impossible thing, and walks back out without ever once raising their voice. Colonel Donovan had tried to remove her from his range. He had looked at the most feared SEAL sniper alive and seen a tourist. And in doing so, he taught every man who witnessed it the most important lesson a soldier can learn. Never mistake silence for weakness. Never mistake humility for insignificance. And never, ever refuse to read the envelope. Sarah Mitchell brought Cardinal home. She forged 7 failures into the finest team any of them would ever serve on. She gave a broken colonel his soul back and a young sergeant his future. And she did all of it without ever raising her voice because the most feared sniper alive had learned long ago the one truth that rank can never teach and pride can never understand. Greatness doesn't shout. It simply arrives, does what must be done, and lets the silence that follows say everything.